Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Peter Kimani?
This is Kimani speaking.
Peter, what a pleasure to have you on the line. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Tell me, how have you been spending these last 3 months of the quarantine, or 4 months? And where does this phone call find you?
Well, thanks so much for calling, Paul. This call finds me in Kenya on the outskirts of Nairobi. So I live, what you might call peri-urban. So not the village, not the city, something in between.
Right.
So you just called me minutes after my arrival from Nairobi, which is about 40 minutes away. On a good day, that might mean 2 or 3 hours commute. That's how our development has turned out. So movement is terrible in this city.
Even now during the pandemic.
Especially now during the pandemic.
Why?
Because there is a partial lockdown. Places are curfew at certain times of the day. So everyone is trying to stampede out of town before the curfew. So right now the curfew is 9 p.m., which coincided with your phone call at 9 p.m. East African time. Previously, I think we had a lockdown for 7. Again, you anticipated a movement around 5 and 6 p.m. people to be heading out of town for their homes. So my experience this past, I think, 3.5 months, we have been on semi-lockdown. So we've been able to move within certain parts of the country. So we have about, in American parlance, you might call them states, but here we call them counties. So I'm able to navigate within 3 or 2 such areas. But I cannot travel to my village, which is just an hour's drive away. So I haven't seen the larger clan for this duration. And so this is probably the longest time I've been away from that space. I routinely go maybe once every few weeks back to the village to meet my extended family. So I am in this part of town with my 2 boys and their mom. And yeah, so school is out. So that means even the boys are grounded also.
Right.
And so is the mother.
Do they have, as we have here, do they have their classes online? Is that part of your daily work?
Yes.
Is it also Zoom calls?
Zoom call and Google Classroom. We've been going through those motions. So this particular week, my son, who's only 5, has been spending up to 3 hours of his life and my life as well on Zoom.
And what do you think about that? What do you think about a 5-year-old spending 3 hours on Zoom? I'm curious how that plays out in your mind, and maybe also how that plays out in his mind.
Well, I'm trying to appreciate the difficult task that teachers have to perform in class to impart knowledge, given the level of distraction, and so the attention is very fleeting. So that means I sit with him because I have to help him maneuver through my computer. So I am starting to appreciate the difficult task that teachers perform. Well, I am a teacher, myself, but I teach grown-ups. But teaching, youngsters at that age is a huge, commitment, because when I sit in and listen to the conversations, I appreciate it's not an easy task at all. But let's face it, there is, of course, he is very privileged, this son of mine, because he can access a computer. He's got access to the internet. The vast majority of children in this country have no such access.
Right, that's what I was going to ask you. So what do they... So I was exactly going to ask you that. So, the disparities are so great. So what do they do? And how do the schools work with a population that may not have access to the internet at all?
Yeah, so in a way, Paul, I think this pandemic has exposed all those weak points in our system, because it's not for lack of resources that not every child in this country has access to the internet or a computer. Because we had a scheme about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, to provide solar-powered laptops to every school-going child in this country. In fact, that was the pledge made by the government. This was downgraded to a tablet. Ultimately, what they received, I can't recall what gadget it was, but it was a watered-down version of the original. But in other words, the project just fell through the bureaucratic cracks. So we don't have access uniformly. So private education appears to be accessing these facilities more easily. Right. But education is a public good. It should be accessible to every child on the universe. We are at this point, I think, what this pandemic has done is to expose years, sometimes decades, of social inequities. If I recall, this past week I read the UK, 2 million of British children have not learned anything since the schools closed. So you might say inequities and those imbalances are universal in that sense.
And as you have correctly said, I think it has only highlighted the disparities, the inequities. And I suppose, and perhaps we'll get to that in a moment, perhaps this is a moment which it might be a portal, it might be an opening, it might be a realization that we need to live differently. A few years ago, Peter, you said literature is just about the only free thing left in the world. Do you really think this is true? And if you do, how does it manifest itself?
Right. Yeah, I think my statement has been borne out, over the years, increasingly so. That when I sit to create a work of fiction, a work of art, it allows us. Now, I'm talking of my possibilities as a writer to speak truth unfiltered. So I served, on national press in this country. I wrote for publications in other parts of the world. But I think the world of journalism is shrinking increasingly now. Through Corona, you've seen the media as they are constructed will have to be reconfigured to survive and to be viable again. So you can imagine the kind of pressure that journalists are being put through right now. There are certain things they cannot say because it's not politically right to say. Or maybe those who hold the purse strings, might not like it. So journalism has been, in my estimation, been under such immense strain that what's finally, published, and I'm speaking now specifically of our context in Kenya, it will be a watered-down version of truth as people might know it. So what we highlight, for instance, they are pressing social issues that won't see light of day, mainly because of class considerations, economic demographics that are targeted. So what you see through a creative work, on the other hand, will be an amalgamation of a writer's view of the world as he sees it, and the only censor, if any, here is the writer himself, because you're also writing to sometimes an audience that you imagine exists somewhere. Yeah. So in other words, it's a philosophical question, but I think literature, to me, appear to be the height of freedom, artistic freedom.
You are interested, and you are speaking about amalgamation. You're interested in the full, as you say, complexity of the cultural mosaic that forms or informs Kenyan society. Can you give us a sense? I mean, it's so precious for people listening to this program now. Can you give us a sense of that cultural mosaic? What does it contain? I know it contains multitudes, but what are some of them?
Yeah. All right. So my society comprises multiple ethnic groupings. We have about 46 communities, each with a distinct language, history, culture. And then you also have races. You have whites, you have blacks, you have Arabs, you have Indians. So even when I write, my last novel, Dance of the Jacaranda, I drew from all these groupings and tried to fuse their stories into one aesthetic whole, which is to say that Kenya is not one specific entity, an amalgamation, a mix of all these influences fused together by forces of history to make one whole. So I appreciate the complexity of doing that, because each story appears to be a representation of something. But I find increasingly my work will always be a representation of something more than just one. So if I may share briefly what I'm writing right now.
Please,
another
please.
historical novel set in Kenya in 1990s, 1991 to be specific. And through my research, I found, although I was a young man, not very, very savvy with the world and how it functioned, I found there were connections, although there were disruptions, social, political disruptions, in Somalia, where my main characters are coming into Kenya. And you have a young man who's never left his backyard, and he's interacting with well-traveled refugees or people who are transiting to some other space. How he sees the world is transformed completely. So even his idea of what it means to be Kenyan, which is a question we'll be reviewing afterwards, he cannot quite delineate all these other experiences and say this is a trajectory of my history, because it meanders. They are crooked jogs of history that in a way illustrate the connectivity of human experience. So whether it's a young Somali man or woman finding their way to another part of the world, or a Kenyan who goes through similar journeys, each of my character is trying to discover the world in their own terms. And the world would be very, sometimes rigid in the way they interpret them, because they see them as representations of other places and spaces. But I think the world is a lot more complex and also interconnected.
You've said something that I find so interesting. You said writers require distancing to see things clearly, which brought to mind a line of Italo Svevo, where he says you see things less clearly when you open your eyes too wide. I'm wondering if you can unpack this a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do find that to be a very deep summation of my own experiences. So I'll say all my works, previous fiction that I've published, have all been written from a distance. So like the Jacaranda Dance of the Jacaranda, partly, written in the US.
Yes.
Now my current work, this is the first book that's set in Nairobi. So every other piece of fiction I've done from afar. So it's the first time that's set in my hometown. But then I'm on the fringe of Nairobi. So I'm not in Nairobi exactly. I have refused the temptation to go back to that space because I like the distancing. So this is how I see it. Writers tend to be very emotive in the way they relate to their materials. At least that's how I think of myself. So I have distanced myself literally as well as psychologically, because the memory that I am trying to encapsulate in my work is frozen in time. It's what I recall in 1991 when I was a 20-year-old. So I think Nostos, the poem, appears to illuminate this vision that all we are trying to do as adults is to recall our childhoods. And if I'm writing about a childhood that's long forgotten right now, I'll say to you, this pandemic has been a blur. I haven't been fully engaged to it. I know there is a lot of news. I have been very selective about what I read, but I've been stuck in my small world in 1991. So this poem appears to encapsulate this vision the vision that I have for the book appears to be summarized in these few verses. And every work I do, I tend to find there is a signature tune. There is something that echoes in my mind that encapsulates my own story. And this,
you're talking
this is it.
You're talking in a way. I feel like you're talking around the notion of exile.
Yes. And we can be exiled even when we are in the midst of individuals. We can be exiled, even when you are in a group of people, but you are stuck in your own mind. But yeah, you're right. I am exiled in the 1990s Nairobi, even as we go through the motion of this pandemic, as the world is roiled by this contagion. I am safely exiled in a space that's safe and secure with my characters, communing with them, finding meaning as they did, as I envisioned this journey. So exile absolutely is a mission.
And this brings to mind something that you and I once shared, a poem by Louise Gluck that I think is meaningful to you. And if I might ask you to read it and then comment on why it resonates with you, and I think it.
Sure.
Well, I won't say anything. I'll let you say it.
All right, I can read now.
Please do.
There was an apple tree in the yard. This will have been 40 years behind. Only meadow drifts of crocus in the damp grass. I stood at that window, late April, spring flowers in the neighbor's yard. How many times really did the tree flower on my birthday? The exact day, not before, not after? Substitution of the immutable, of the shifting, the evolving. Substitution of the image for relentless earth. What do I know of this place? The role of the tree for decades, taken by a bonsai, voices rising from the tennis courts, fields, smell of the tall grass, new cut, as one expects of a lyric poet. We look at the wild ones in childhood. The rest is memory. That's the end of the song.
Tell me.
Mm-hmm. So when I read it, and I went through the images of spring, the images of nature, innocence, milestones, memory, I thought that's exactly what I was trying to evoke in my new work. And what stood out for me is actually the last line. In fact, when I was trying to recall, because I hadn't registered the author, I sent to you that particular line that is about childhood and memory. And you spent a few hours rummaging through the files to retrieve it. We look at the world once in childhood, the rest is memory. In a way, when I think about that, it seems to suggest to me, as I am trying to evoke in this new work, and what has been my labors, going through readings from that duration, is that maybe that's all I've known about the world, are stuck in these childhood memories, and I find it fascinating that that's what my story appears to be aspiring to achieve, to evoke a childhood as a manifestation of our entirety. And of course, that's very difficult. Thank you.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that the listeners need to know is that this poem by Louise Gluck is entitled Nostos, which is half of nostalgia, which is really a pain for the return, a longing for the return, which of course is so fitting with everything you're saying. I want to talk about one of your mentors, Ngugi and Thiong'o. And I think you've studied his work deeply, and I'm curious both of your relationship with him and the choice you have made to write in English, and whether someday you may write in another language.
Sure. So Ngugi has been a very instrumental force in my development as a writer. We met actually physically for the first time in California, not in Kenya, because he had been exiled for 22 years. So when I finished my first novel, Before the Rooster Crows, I mailed a copy to him, and I told him, "You might not know me, but you've been very important in my development. So this is in appreciation to your work and for helping me along the way." So many months later, I managed to visit California. I went up to Irvine, where he teaches, and so we were meeting in exile, because he was still exiled until he returned a few months later. So when I returned to the States to pursue a PhD in creative writing and literature at the University of Houston, I asked him to be my external supervisor, and he thankfully agreed to join the panel. So we were, of course, communicating over a long duration as I progressed on my program. But he physically came to the States. He came to Houston for my defense. And so we've collaborated on a number of projects. So when I returned to teach at Amherst College in 2017, I hosted him in 2018. He came to mark his 80th birthday in New England. So we had some mini festival celebrating his work. We had a new film that had been produced on his life. There's a stage reading of his play, and of course we had discussions and book readings that we gave together.
And what matters to you in his work? What matters to you in his work? Why does it resonate so strongly for you?
So my great attachment to his work, and this is something I have explained in some of our conversations, is that, when I was growing up in a small village outside Nairobi, and I read Weep Not Child, which is a seminal novel,
yes,
is that it was an experience that was relatable. So we had grown up in a diet of American and British fiction, the Hardy Boys, Agatha Christie. So when I finally read Ngugi, I found he's writing about a space that I was familiar with, characters with names like people I knew in the village. And so I always return to that story that it is actually on the strength of the book Dublab on the back of Weep Not Child and Chinua Achebe's The Things Fall Apart that I decided I wanted to pursue a career in creative writing because I thought these young men are writing books and they seem to have pursued this career. Of course, I didn't know how hard it is to be published, but I was emboldened in my pronouncement even before I knew what it meant to write a book, that I wanted to be a writer.
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
so you included Ngugi, I believe, in your new collection, Nairobi Noir, that Akashic Books has published under the leadership of Johnny Temple. And I'm curious, both what Ngugi's piece was and what putting that collection meant for you. And I think it will be interesting for our listeners to know about it because they will get a whole new reading list from getting that volume.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So Nairobi Noah was commissioned to us to me by Akashic. I was given the task of putting together generations of Kenyan writers. Of course, I was given a brief, what to do, the kind of stories I was expecting. But it was up to the writers to decide what to put together. So it was a very productive and fruitful experience. I had we have about 14 writers in the anthology. We had maybe as many numbers that didn't make into the anthology finally because we had some serious, revisions to do until I was fully satisfied. I tend to be very heavy-handed, even to myself, so the threshold was pretty high. But when I got this out, I remember one of the writers telling me, "I am glad you do not mention to me who are the other contributors, because if I knew Ngugi was writing in this anthology, I'll have been very intimidated." But I can say one of the greatest, fulfillments of editing that publication is that maybe half the writers are writing for the first time.
How wonderful!
These are people who are unknown completely, never been read beyond our borders. And of course, getting Ngugi, who is among the best known living writers in the world. You can even think of this as a form of mentorship that Ngugi is providing a space there to encourage the young writers. Ngugi is 82 now. I think the youngest contributor was about 23 or 24. So I can proudly say the book represents, generations of Kenyan writers in one collection, and I think that's unprecedented in our literary history. So the book, Nairobi Noah, has, of course, 14 voices, half of them heard for the first time. And Ngugi gives us a satirized view of religion. There is one villager who seems to be deluded about turning skin and getting white. And then he's got this hat. It's called a hermit in the helmet. So readers need to find it just to experience, Ngugi's elements of magical realism, political satire, all distilled through this very, very nuanced narrative about cultural imperialism, which is what Ngugi has been campaigning against for nearly 60 years of his life.
How wonderful! I hope our listeners will get the collection Nairobi Noir that Akashic Books brought out, edited by you.
Sure.
I really do hope so. And it's been such a pleasure, Peter, to speak with you. I think we got a little sense of what's happening to you in Kenya, and I'm really delighted you took the time, and I hope we meet again, and stay safe. And
thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Reconnecting on this. On this World Wide Web.
I know.
Thank you so much for calling.
You're so
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and take good
Thank
care.
you, Paul.
All the best to you.
You too. Stay well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.